Okay, I welcome Vipul sir. Professor Vipul Singh teaches in the Department of History, University of Delhi. He has been mostly educated in Delhi. He did his graduation from Ramjas College and went on to complete his MA, MPhil, and PhD from the Department of History, Delhi University. He has over 20 years of teaching and research experience. Professor Vipul Singh was awarded the prestigious postdoctoral fellowship in 2013 by the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, Germany. An environmental historian trained in early modern Indian history, his major area of focus has been ecologically harsh zones of India, such as arid western Rajasthan and floodplains of the Ganga and the Indian Ocean world. His most recent publications include a book titled Speaking Rivers, Environmental History of a Mid-Ganga Flood Country 2018, and research papers titled Cyclones, Shipwrecks and Environmental Anxiety, British Rule and Ecological Change in the Andaman Islands, the 1780s to 1900s, Global Environment 2020, and Governing Fluvial Commons in Colonial Bihar, Alluvial and Diluvian Regulation and Decommunization, Rutledge 2021. He is currently working on a book project on the effects of global climate anomalies and oceanic circulations in early modern India. His other research interests include the study of fluvial landscapes, inland fisheries, plantation ecology, cultural ecology, migration, popular culture as depicted in folklores, and vernacular literature and historical GIS. He is on the editorial board of the Water History Journal published by Springer. In 2019, the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations Committee awarded him at the World Congress of Environmental History in Florianopolis, Brazil, for his research. The education and the strong endorsement of his continuous work on the environmental history. Professor Vipul Singh is also often seen on TV news channels sharing his views on different historical issues. He is speaking today on a river flooding in my heart. Thank you, sir, for coming here. I would request Professor Seema Baba ma'am to please take over.
Yeah, hello, welcome Vipul, and welcome all of you. So we look forward to hearing from Vipul, who is one of our foremost environmental historians, and at the moment, the only environmental historian in our department. And he is at the helm of grooming a lot of students who are taking this program forward. And this is a very, very important field. And I think that not only in pluvial discourse and talking about rivers, but he also does a lot of work in terms of conservation and technologies of conservation of and policy, I think, and that is very important to understanding how water was managed and used in historical time. So over to Professor Vipul Singh. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the talk as much as I'm sure I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you so much. Thank you, Arushi, also for this very kind words and very generous kind of an introduction that you gave. And a very warm afternoon to all my colleagues, Parul, Razi, everyone, all my departmental colleagues, and many of my friends who have joined on Zoom and Facebook Live. In fact, I'm especially thankful to my colleague, Razi. He's been my friend for years, and he has actually constantly been pursuing me to share my work and share the work with the students, share the work with the wider audience. We have been discussing a lot about the kind of research that I'm undertaking, but this is for the first time that I'm speaking with a wider public in the department, which is actually going so widely because of the effort of Razi and Professor Seema Bawa. Now, the story that I'm going to present today is actually part of my forthcoming monograph. And it's a further build-up of my earlier proposition. I think I've already been telling many of my researchers and students that uh, very gripping stories of the past can be written by bringing these nature aspects, especially if you bring rivers at the center of your historical analysis. And this I argued in my book that was published 2 years ago, which Arushi just mentioned, The Speaking Rivers. That book actually presented 3 centuries of transformation that Bihar experienced. In fact, I amassed a lot of evidences of the kind of transformation that I talked about in that book. So, in fact, especially, I talked about the transformation that happened, especially with the coming of the Mughals and then subsequently under the East India Company. Now, this piece is slightly different, and I mentioned a little bit of it in my book, but then I did not expand there. It is only later on with my further evidences and kind of discussions with my colleagues in a wider environmental history academia that I developed this paper with their discussion. And in fact, over the last few months, I've been able to develop this. So in a way, it is still a work in progress. So obviously, at the end of the talk, I would be, looking forward to your comments and observation, especially my colleagues uh, who are present here. The title of this talk, this river flooding in my heart, it's actually a translated portion from the lyrics of a 15th century vernacular text. And in that text, the poet presents the male-female passionate relationship. And he presents this relationship through a romanticized river. In fact, both in the 15th and the 16th centuries, you'll find that such expressions of the relationship of human with nature has been expressed in vernaculars. Now, the reason I have picked up for my analysis is Eastern Indian province, which was also there in my book earlier, that is Bihar. So, what I've done that as a researcher, I have been, seeing a lot of scope for further research in this area, and I see this region as a terraqueous landscape. It's a landscape which has huge strips of land, and you have plenty of water bodies in the form of rivers there. Now, today, you will find that the state is known for its recurrent flood almost every year, and which leads to huge destruction all around. So you've been hearing that in news quite often. But it's very surprising that the early modern vernacular pieces of literature and various other accounts also, they are all silent about such calamitous representation. They rather see this region as culturally very dynamic. So I'll actually come back to this a little later. Let me first give you a sense and also the context of what my story is all about. Much of the writings, as we know, on Indian environmental history revolve around the themes of 19th and 20th centuries. And one of the reasons for this is obviously the absence of very explicit nature related descriptions in medieval chronicles. Now, the sources are all the sources of the 19th and the 20th century. They are full of political and economic information. But the subject of nature are seemingly missing in these sources of the medieval times, or for that matter, early modern times. Now, the direct repercussion of this is that the South Asian environmental history has mostly coiled around the discourses on colonialism. And most of the environmental histories that you will find, they are, you know, they are talking about the coming of the British. I mean, you will find that how the British, or the coming of the British, was a watershed moment in the human nature relationship. So, the research questions in all these works have been actually driven by, enormous availability of archival sources. So these sources are obviously available in many of the regional archives. You will find, you go to any regional archive, you will find tremendous data related to, into different regions, and they are very unexplored data. I mean, which can be used for writing environmental histories. You go to National Archives of India, you go to British Library in London. So everywhere you have whole lot of data which has very very useful data for writing environmental histories. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the colonial period documents contain numerous such data information which relate to land, which relate to forests, which will relate to rivers, and you will even animals. And even today, nowadays, people have started working on the weather patterns. So, you talk about, like, I've been working on the Indian Ocean world now, and I'm trying to look at the climate anomaly. You will see that you have a lot of data related to climate and weather. Now, since such definitive information is easily seen in the colonial sources, what we do as a researcher, history researcher, we have this tendency of, seizing the low-hanging ripeness fruits first. So we, you know, pick those fruits which are ripe, which are lying low on the trees, and then write our histories. Now the question is, I mean, this is one of the challenges that I've been facing a lot while I've been, trained to write environmental history, or been trained to write early modern period of history, or read an early modern period of history. So one of the challenges that I face is about the, kind of sources that that is available to us, on the basis of which we can write environmental histories of early modern times. Now, one of the ways could be combining the available sources, whatever sources are available. You will see that, and I've witnessed that in many of the Persian narrative, many of the sources, you don't get such very direct kind of information that we find in the colonial records. You don't find this in the Persian narratives. So you have to read it very carefully, very closely, and then try to see what exactly can be used for the writing environmental history. But then, apart from that, we can also actually combine it with a vernacular literature. And we may use the nature description in the vernacular as some kind of, emotional relationship of human with nature. So in recent years, historians have started doing environmental literary criticism, of fictional texts from past centuries. And this new methodology is termed as eco-criticism. Now, through eco-criticism, various nature elements have been studied in relation to the humankind. And this eco-criticism argues that environment is actually not exclusively the material aspect of the past that we find in the colonial document, right? So it's not only about, that what nature is, how the forest is, how much forest was taken away, or how much deforestation happened, or there has been, changes in the river system, all this stuff, which we find in the colonial document. So you won't find such information in the vernacular literatures. But eco-criticism says that you can use such vernacular literatures to write environmental histories. So what eco-criticism says is that you can talk about the human perception of nature and then try to use those perceptions through the writings of the authors of the time, and then use that as not in abstract terms, but in a more what we can say as in a more indirect way to write the environmental histories. Now we can know about the way human beings perceive their natural surroundings through the various kinds of literary texts that are available. Now, all literary texts won't be giving you such information. So we have to, pick such certain category of literary texts of the time, which talk about the relationship of human with nature. Now, historians have already been practicing and writing literary criticism of the older texts. Professor Raziuddin is here, who has been working on various vernacular texts. So, and many other colleagues in my department have been working on the vernacular literatures. Historians, in fact, take up the issues like the kind of historical audiences that the literary texts were composed. So, we actually take up such issues like what Schulman and others say the texture of the literature. So in those terms, the historians have been looking at the various historical vernacular texts. Now, similarly, for writing the environmental histories through literary texts, we try to understand how particular texts are what should I say? How it is these texts are entangled with the society. How the author of the text has used common people's conception. We can also talk about the societies, how societies conceptualize their environment. So things like that can be looked into the relevant vernacular texts. So here in this paper, I have tried to blend the two types of sources to study the mid-Ganga area, and I've used both the chronicles and the vernacular texts. Now, this region, as I said earlier, that it is not only historically dynamic, but it is also a terraqueous region. It is a land, it is a zone, it is a area which consists of a lot of land and it consists of a lot of water. So I try to understand how the attitude of the people towards nature, particularly the river, it is represented in the vernaculars and then the other sources. So my aim is to closely examine the imagery, and then what we do is that we try to tie these imagery, especially of the river Ganga, which flows through right from the center of Bihar, and then we use these imageries and combine it with many of the Persian chronicles of the time. So during the course of my discussion, in fact, I would touch upon a few of the broader questions. Number one, that what role do the ecology or the physical character of a region play in the construction of a political space? And while I'll say so, I understand that I might run into the risk of giving sort of environmental deterministic interpretation. I know many of the environmental historians do not agree to this idea of or this kind of an interpretation of environmental determinism. But I'm not talking about environmental determinism here. Let me make it very clear. And it's not my idea actually. also, because whatever be the physical character of a region, which I have been emphasizing here in this paper, the human actions actually play an important role. And that is why you will find that the mid-Ganga region acquired the character of a political space in the 16th century and not earlier. Because this kind of an ecology, this kind of an ecological understanding was there for years, for centuries. But why this kind of a political space could not come up before? So there was certain and human intervention because of which this change came. So I'm not exactly talking about environmental determinism here. Now, the second point that I'm trying to explore is how can we use, or how can we look at the past uh, through the prism of the rivers, right? And very much related to this question is another one which I'll be dealing with is how the river is one of the main actors in the in such kind of terraqueous landscape. How do the socio-ecological construction of the past lend constancy to the identity of a region? So these are a few of the questions that I'll be uh, discussing in my talk now. May I request Arushi to show slide number 1?
Yes.
Yeah. So, in this slide, you can see that it's a mid-Ganga basin, map of mid-Ganga basin, which is actually, just a minute. So this slide that you see here, it is identified with the uh, modern day Bihar, and there are many rivers you can see here which are coming from the north of the Ganga, which is flowing right at the center here. And there are many rivers which are coming from the Himalayas, and then there are many rivers which are joining the Ganges from the south. Now, in this middle Ganga section, the Ganga actually flows from west to east. And here the flow of water is very spread out. And this is largely due to the, the different rivers which are meeting from north and south side. And then, that's why the water in the Ganges is so much there in the middle section. That's why the geographers have been calling this as a middle section, which is unique in its own way. Otherwise, the upper section of the Ganga has, huge gorges. So the river comes through the gorges, but here it is more spread out. You will find that the depth of the river is it's very deep there. And that's why you have navigation throughout the year. Now, these channels which meet the Ganga, these are all not all Himalayan rivers. You have all the rivers which are coming from the north. They are Himalayan rivers, like the Ganga, the Gandak, Buri, Gandak, Kosi. I mean, these are the major rivers. There are more. Other rivers as well. And then you have a few rivers like the Chambal, the Kane, and the Son River. They are originating in the central part of India, and then they feed the Ganga Basin on the south. Now, because of these meeting of the rivers from both sides, a huge amount of sediments get deposited in the Ganga plains during the floods. And this sediment is actually very useful for agriculture. And that's why historically, you will see that the political authorities have always eyed this very fertile zone for, because of its the revenue potential. Now, I have argued elsewhere that how the British took over the region in 1765, and how 1765 was a turning point in the riverine ecology. Yeah, and in another paper which was published recently, I have shown how even the the avulsed land was not spared, because this is an area, this is a region where you often get these avulsions taking place. Avulsion is some kind of a uh, what in Bengal is known as the Chor land. In Bihar, it is known as the Diara land. Now, these are avulsions of avulsed land. These are the new land which come up, and every year you have a new land coming up. Now, the British realized that this is a kind of land that the zamindars are having possession. So let's have control over these lands also. So I explained about uh, the new regulation that was introduced by the British government in 1825 to take control of such land and to regulate the frequently changing landscape of Bihar and Bengal. And it all happened when East India Company took the control of the region. Now, Bihar as an administrative region was already there when the East India Company was having control of it. But my story actually begins 2.5 centuries before that, when uh, Bihar as a political and administrative space had not come into existence. So, the early modern perception of what I call as a socio-ecological space, this played a very crucial role in the making of political space in the 16th century. So this is my main argument, that how this socio-ecological space, which existed for centuries, was realized only in the 16th century. And then there was a creation of a political space in the 16th century. So that's the main argument of my talk today. So the riverine character of the mid-Ganga, the mid-Ganga region, this evolved broadly similar kind of cultural tradition, which is actually reflected in many of the vernacular literatures. Let's talk about that. Now, in the writings of the vernacular scholars of 15th and 16th century, we get good reflections of this kind of a socio-ecological space that I just mentioned. The people living here in this mid-Ganga area, they identified themselves with the Ganga, and they identified themselves with Ganga through various rituals. Now, a few of the vernacular authors whose works have been able to look at from this perspective are the works of Vishwadevi, then you have the work of Vidyapati, and you have work of Manjan Rajgiri. Now, all these authors are from 15th and the 16th century, and they give you a good sense of the ecologically homogeneous society. Let us first begin with the not all the works of these scholars you will find talking about these uh, ecological societies, but here I have picked up few of the vernacular texts of these authors which actually talk about these things. And one such work is that of Vidyapati, which is Vidyapati, as you know, he belonged to North Bihar, we belong to Madhubani, and he composed many texts, he composed many poetries, not only in Mathili, but also in Sanskrit. So, and all these texts became very popular. So he used to write in different languages. So, his, his popularity extended even in Bengal. And earlier on, people used to believe that he belonged to Bengal, but then later on it was found that he actually belonged to North Bihar. That's why he wrote extensively in Maithili. Now, the songs he wrote as prayers to Lord Shiva are still sung in Mithila, and many of us know. And it has it's sung in different forms, and it has very rich tradition of rhythmic and kind of a lovely folk version of it. In fact, if you read Abul Fazl, he has mentioned about the popularity of the lyrics of Vidyapati. Now, the region to which Vidyapati belong is obviously it is located in north of the Ganga, and for him or like any other inhabitant of this region, the much closer region is actually Bagmati. But it is the Ganga that finds greater attention in his composition, you will find. And many of his works like Padavali or the Bhumi Parikramana or Kirti Lata, these are a few of the works where Vidyapati often locates his tales and the moral stories on the banks of the Ganga. And in all these stories, you will find that the river is actually, exemplified as some for its purity. In fact, Bhumi Parikraman was it was composed by him, and it followed the old Puran tradition, and many of the Purana stories are mentioned there. And he has conceived 8 different geographical zones in this text. And all these 8 geographical zones are along the Ganges. Now, each zone is associated with a story. And in fact, the later part of the text, you will find that in particular, the later half, it gives you it gives you a very good idea and a good sense of the geography of the mid-Ganga region. And it mentions about the places situated on the banks of the river Ganga. Even he talks about the Son river and different locations around Son. Now, when you read this text, you'll find that he tries to convey a message of some kind of political and religious wisdom, not exactly political, but it's more of a religious wisdom. And he does this in the guise of various romantic stories. Now, these stories are obviously situated in the riverine ecology of the Middle Ganga. That's why I picked up this text. Similarly, you have another interesting text, Kirti Lata, that was composed in the local Avahatta Bhasha, and it talks about the Mithila king. But then, along with this king's story, it talks about different moralities. Talks about obviously the in many of the texts the masculinity factor is there, but here also, apart from masculinity, it talks about the geography of the region. And it is very well entangled with his stories. He has ingrained the geography very minutely while he tells the stories in this text. And the most interesting text is the Padavali, which is actually composed although in Maithili, and it is very musical and connected directly with the people. So, in fact, it is said that the ruler of that time, he was so spellbound by the lyrics of the poetry of Padavali that he attacked this very special singer to Vidyapati, and whose work was that after every verse which was composed by Vidyapati, this guy Jayata, his name was Jayata, he would create a tune for him. And he would then sing the song before the king and the ladies, and then gradually there were dancing girls who were performing on these songs. And gradually these songs were then spread across the entire Mathili speaking community, and then further in the entire Mid-Ganga region. So Padavali is very popular even today, you will find, and it is sung by the ladies of the household during various ceremonies. Now, this text is significant from the point of view of socio-ecological space that I just mentioned, because this socio-ecological space has been conceived by the poet surrounding the Mid-Ganga plain. The local environment has been embedded in the narratives, and in all these three texts that I mentioned, this you will find there somehow. Now, obviously, these are not very direct references. You have to read them very closely, what exactly the author is trying to suggest. But in most of these texts, you will find that the romanticized river is a frequent image. Obviously, the environment of Mid-Ganga plain is very clearly pictured in these poetries of Vidyapati. Similarly, there is another very interesting work by Vishwadevi, which is titled as Ganga Bhaktivali. And this Ganga Bhaktivali is another very interesting and significant work of the 15th century. And it is also very rich in terms of rituals and the traditions associated with the Ganga. And it was actually when Vishwadevi is actually a contemporary of Vidyapati, and she was in fact the wife of a king of Mithila. After his death, Vishwadevi himself had ascended the throne of Mithila. So she has written this text, Ganga Bhaktivali, and it is again based on the Purana stories. But then in this text, the author also records her own viewpoints on the prevalent rites and rituals associated with the Ganga. And this text again is rich in terms of the geographical space that the author has in mind. So reading this text, we can sense that the poet is repeatedly emphasizing how Ganga created some kind of a ecological space. There is a frequent reference to combined body of Hari and Hara, which is in fact identified with the Sonpur fair. Now it's there in the poster which I sent to Professor Razi, and it's a painting of 1820. Arushi, can you show this slide too? So, yeah. So this slide actually is it's a painting from 1820, and this is Harihar Chhatra Mela of Sonpur. This has been taking place for centuries, this Mela, and this Hari and Har combination has also been mentioned by Vishwadevi in Ganga Bhaktivali. So, in fact, the Harihar Chhatra Mela, which is known as Sonpur Mela nowadays, it is normally held on the banks of the Gandak River. It is actually here where Gandak and the Ganges meet. So it is on the confluence of the two rivers. Now, sometimes because of the evulsions taking place in these parts, the venue of the Mela shifts. It happened once also in under the Mughals. It is mentioned in the Mughal accounts. During Aurangzeb period, there was a major shift. But but then it comes back again when the lands are not flooded in the original place. The Mela takes place there. But the most interesting part of the venue is that it has a temple. It has a temple of Harihara, and it is located here on the confluence of the two rivers. Hari means Vishnu and Hari is the Shiva. So this has been referred by Vishwadevi in her poetry too, when she talks about the different rituals along the Ganges. Now, if you will find that in many of the 17th century account, later in the 18th century account, even Francis Buchanan in his account of would mention about this Mela, this fair, which used to happen in across the Ganga and people from far off region of Patna, Gaya, even North Bihar, they were coming, and they were coming in from different caste categories. And this has been mentioned by Buchanan also. Now, obviously, the kind of caste category that Buchanan talks about, it was not there in the earlier accounts, but the very mention that this kind of a mela is happening for centuries is evident from many of the Mughal accounts. Now, the third author, in fact, that I have picked up uh, for my understanding of a sociological zone is Madhu Malti, which was written by Manjan Rajgiri. It was written in 1545, and obviously it was written in Avdi. This guy, Mir Sayyid Manjan Rajgiri, this is his full name. This guy belonged to Rajgir. That's why he is known as Rajgiri. He has this title Rajgiri, which is Rajgir is quite close to Patna and Bihar. And Manjan actually composed this a very interesting romantic story in verse, and this was composed, as I mentioned, in 1545. This was a time when the Mughal Empire was struggling to regain its ground, and the Sur Afghans were dominating Bihar even after the death of Sher Shah. In fact, Manjan mentions about the uh, the demise of Sher Shah during the siege of Kalinjar Fort in this text. So it's this text is actually a beautiful love story of Manohar and Madhumalti. Now, while describing the kind of love and the story that the poet talks about, the 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 typical landscape that has been shown in the entire uh, text by Manjan is actually very much similar to the Mid Ganga Basin. Even if he talks about the kind of landscape, it's very much similar to Mid Ganga Basin. It's the kind of flow of the Ganga he talks about. It's very much similar to the Mid Ganga area. The kind of description that it gives of the mango trees, the blossoming of the mango trees in Asar, or the humming of the black honeybees in Chat, or the celebration of Holi. The kind of celebration that he mentions is in it, which is held in Fagun. So all these description, the author actually situates his his plot of the love story in a riverine plain. Now, obviously, you have, as I mentioned, one has to give a very close reading to the text to understand what is there in the text. It is not very direct, so you have to read it very closely and carefully to understand that what is there in the poetry. Now, in all these texts that I just mentioned, we find a striking similarity. the terraqueous ecology of the mid-Ganga basin is very, uh, very aptly mirrored, even when, the writers often allude to Puranic stories, or they are talking about some fictional stories, fictional love stories. So the stories um, conveyed through the vernacular literature, uh, all these literatures that I just mentioned, they hint towards a socio-ecological homogeneity among the people who were living in the mid-Ganga plain. Now, when we read various contemporary Persian narratives of the 16th century, we are able to derive very interesting incidents of the socio-ecological and political connections in the region. In fact, when I read many of the Persian chronicles which mention about Bihar, they suggest that gaining the control of this area, the revenue giving area of Middle Ganga section, it was never very easy for all the medieval and the early modern uh, dynasties, even for for the Mughals, or earlier even for the Turks. Uh, for the local rulers, it was not so challenging because their knowledge of rivers, what we call as the ebbs and flows, the way river recede, the way river brings in a lot of water when there is a lot of water in the river. All these kinds of knowledge were already there, and to the local rulers, and it proved as an advantage for these local rulers, but not for the Turks and the Mughals. So it's not that the Turks have never tried to control this area. During the entire 14th century, or even earlier in the 13th century, the Turks did make an attempt to take control of the area. Obviously, they were coming at that time on horseback, and they tried to invade the area. So, in fact, there is a very interesting work which I have tried to argue here in this paper. The work of Victor Lieberman, who calls the entire Indo-Gangetic plain as an exposed zone. Now, I've questioned that because this is an area which is not exposed. This is an area which is not an exposed area, what Lieberman calls as an exposed area. It's actually a protected area. So, the territory of Bihar was invaded by many of the Turks, but they normally extracted tribute from, few of the southern parts of Bihar, and then they normally went away, right? In northern part of Bihar, they did not go because there were a lot of rivers coming from the Himalayas, and it was not easy for them to come on the horseback and rule the territories. Now, medieval sources obviously suggest that Bihar um, did not have a single political entity, and Ganga, or for that matter, the different territories uh, which uh, uh, which were there in the I'm talking about the smaller petty states. They were existing in Bihar, and they often put challenges before the Turks. So it was not easy for the Turks to invade those areas. Now, obviously, there are instances like Jujani mentions about in his Tabtat Nasiri that Tirhut was an area which was a separate region, and it was taken under control. In fact, we have reference of Ghiyasuddin Teglak taking control of the Tirhut region in somewhere around in the first quarter of the 14th century. But you will find that even powerful rulers like Muhammad Shah Tughlaq or Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, they were uh, not able to control the entire area. The entire area of Bhagalpur, Munger, all these areas remained out of the control of the Turks. And then after few centuries of control of the Tirhut region, even they lost it to the Sharkis. So obviously, we have one of the very important uh, inscription at the Zami Mosque in Darbhanga, which talks about the Tughlaq control of the region. So it gives evidence. In fact, it is one of the evidences that we have before us, which says, which proves that Tughlaq took control of that area for few years. Now, Bernie mentions that the entire area went out of the control of the Tughlaqs, and then the Sharkis took over. Later on, we have evidence that the Sharkis took control of the entire western part of Bihar and those areas of North Bihar also. But then in the 16th century, we see that Sikandar Lodi takes over. He comes and then takes back the entire territory. So we have specific mention in many of the Lodi accounts, which says that the territories between if you look at the Bihar map, you have the Ganga River right at the west. It is in fact the western boundary of Bihar. So the territories between Ganga and Gandak, they were brought under control by the Sharkis. Now, this area was then given to the Nuhani Afghans for, as Jagir. And it is here that from the Nuhanis, Sher Shah was able to take control of the entire area of the northern part and part of Shasaram, which his father used to hold. So then Sher Shah was able to take control of the entire mid-Gangetic basin. Now, Sher Shah had grown up in Shahabad, and that's why he fully realized the potential of the region. He was, in fact, he was well-read person, and it is mentioned in Tariq-e-Sher Shahi that he went for his learning. In fact, he must have read about all these texts. He must have heard about many of the vernacular literatures which were popular in the entire area and which talk about, and must have realized also, himself realized that because he's been traveling all along during his journey for studies, that this entire Mid-Ganga region had similar kind of, cultural connects. So, and he realized that there are similar ecologies in the entire Mid-Ganga area. Now, that's why, when Sher Shah comes to rule, he acquires the entire area and then conceives this idea of creating Bihar as a separate province. For the first time that you find the seed of Bihar as a Suba that was sown by Sher Shah. In fact, as I mentioned, that different rulers earlier on tried to take control of different parts of the northern Bihar. South Bihar was already vulnerable because the rivers going through South Bihar were not so flooded throughout the year. But North Bihar rivers were so flooded that it was not easy for the Turks, or even later on the Mughals were not able to take complete control. Now, obviously, Abbas Sharwani has given the details of the land revenue and the land revenue administration initiated by Sher Shah, which was in sync with the local environment, and he says that he was particularly concerned with the suffering of the people. He understood the people very well, and he actually appointed all these local zamindars to do the collections and then collections from the cultivators. So the Sur rule, which expanded under Sher Shah, which later on he went up to Delhi also, but the entire mid-Ganga Gangetic territory was made a separate province, and in fact Patna was made a capital when he had expanded his territory up to Delhi. So for the first time, what we get is the reference of some kind of a territorial demarcation of Bihar in a historical account. So it is Sher Shah who first of all conceived this idea of an administrative Bihar. Now it is during the same time, I just mentioned that just at that time, just before that century, that all these, just before Sher Shah's rule, all these texts were already popular. There are texts of the 15th century. So by the end of the 15th century, these texts have been very popular in those areas. Now, which actually give us an idea of the ecological zone that the poets conceived. Sher Shah also, as a ruler, realized that there is some kind of a ecological similarity of the region, and that's why he conceived this idea of Bihar as a separate province. Now, obviously, we also have many other references of different kinds of, provincial challenges, the challenges that the Mughal face, while especially we have mentioned about Humayun, because when Humayun came, he faced the challenge from Sher Shah in this part. Bengal, he was able to take control, but Bihar was not easy for him. Sher Shah actually waited for Humayun to cross over, and then he attacked. Humayun was in fact not able to cross the river. He had to get the bridge built, and then his army crossed the river. But then by that time, Sher Shah's soldiers had already looted their entire the warheads and everything from Humayun. Now, when Akbar came to rule, Akbar actually realized that Bihar as a Suba has to be, declared as a separate province, which Sher Shah had already done. And then he declares in 1580 that Bihar would be a separate province. Now, this is for the first time that the Mughals have understood that this is a province which has to be declared as a separate province. It has to be administered by a separate governor. Now, he appointed a governor with 7 sarkars. So if you look at slide 3, now it's very interesting that all these sarkars, the 7 sarkars, are actually the sarkar of Bihar, Munger, Champaran, Saran, Rohtas, Hajipur, Tirut. Now, these are actually the boundaries of these sarkars are boundaries of the rivers also, right? So it actually matches, all these rivers actually create the boundaries for all these sarkars. Now, that's very interesting. Now, sarkar was obviously created for, collection of the revenue for smooth administration. Now, apparently, it would have, it seems that Akbar is trying to take control of this entire territory, and he wants to take control of the area and rule properly, and he wants to have a firmer grip over the entire territory. But you will find that he has somehow actually misconceived this idea of creating a separate province which Sher Shah had conceived. Now, let me tell you how, why I'm saying so, because although we don't have much time, I think, Arushi, I think we have time to wind up now, isn't it? So I'll just wind up. We can take up all these issues later on in our discussion. So what I'm actually suggesting that, you have different obstacles taking place. You have different, even Akbar had to face a lot of difficulties when he faces challenges even when he appoints the governors after 1580. So what we see is that all these this area, even despite the fact that this area has been declared as a separate province, and this is not an area which is easy to control. It is very difficult area to control. Even though the Mughals were able to control the rebellions, because there have been rebellions taking place quite often in this area, with their, because the Mughals obviously had huge contingent and armed forces with them. So they used to come with the armed forces and take control of the rebels. But then the moment they used to go away, the local ruler, the local zamindar would come and then defy the order of revenue collection once again. So this early modern history of conflict in this region indicates that the river ecology of the region was very unique, and it not only needed a distinct administrative province that was in sync with the local ecology, but it also needed to be governed by the local zamindars and the zagirdars. Now, Akbar did follow the pattern of Sher Shah, and in fact, he followed the pattern of Sher Shah and created a political region, declared Bihar as a province. But Sher Shah had grown up in this mid-Ganga plain, and so his conception was based on the socio-ecological space. So that's why he appointed all the local zamindars to do the revenue collection work. But Akbar was possibly he actually misconceived this whole idea of socio-ecological space. He considered it to be purely ecological space, and that's how he created a political space out of an ecological space. Whereas the requirement was of creating some kind of a political space which also included the the local rulers. Now I would stop here, and then obviously we can open the floor for the questions with your permission, Razi and Seema.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank you for such an interesting and informative talk. I'm sure everyone here would agree. And now I request Professor Seema Bawa to please share her views.
Yeah, I'm now traveling. So, yeah, thank you, Vipul. First of all, thank you for sharing that wonderful picture of Sonpur, which I really, really liked. And also the cartographs, which again were very nice, and really showed those shapes of how the rivers formed the sarkars. My question to you is that how how does the flooding per se help in creating a political environmental space for control, if it does at all? Does that actually influence the way in which that space is created? And then please, Soumya, if you can ask questions from the Facebook and the chat box.
Yes, ma'am.
Vipul.
So you mentioned about Seema, you mentioned about political ecological space, isn't it? Can you repeat the question once again?
Yeah, I'm saying that does the flooding of the Ganga and its tributaries really make a difference to the way political and ecological control is managed and regulated in the area?
Yeah, certainly, because that's why before Akbar, the attempts were already being made, but then they were unsuccessful largely because of the fact that the entire northern part of Bihar was full of rivers, and these were rivers which had huge amount of water in them. In southern part of Bihar, you have rivers like Son and other rivers like Punpun. You don't have much water in that during the summer peak or during dry days. So the Turks, or for that matter, in the Mughals, they were, easily able to move through those areas on their horseback. Now, flooding, of course, was uh, impediments, one of the challenges for the Turks early on, and then later for the Mughals. And that's why even you will find that not only for Humayun, but even for rulers, powerful rulers like Akbar, you have instances of rebellions and revolts taking place in this part. There is a very interesting episode wherein you will find that Akbar wanted to take control of this area, and then he has to wait on the banks of the river, because he and his contingent was finding it very difficult to cross the river, and there were all the local ruler at that time, they were getting supplies from different sides through the rivers. Now, just because the fort of the Afghan was right at the bank of the Ganges, the supplies came from the rivers, and the Mughals were not able to stop that. Now, it is only after one of the army officers from the Afghan side who defected to the Mughals that he suggested to Akbar that what should be the methodology to defeat the Afghans. So then he suggested a way out, and then the dam, the Punpun dam, was actually broken so that the entire water flows into that part, and then so that the supply doesn't come to the Afghans from one side, and then they were told to invade from the Gandak side. So I mean, these are a few of the instances which are mentioned in many of the Mughal accounts itself. Now, obviously, the fluvial character of the region actually was a great challenge for all the ruling dynasties. But for the local ruler, it proved to be an advantage. I hope I've answered what you will. I've answered the question that you asked.
Sure. So I'm sure there are lots of other questions. So the student and the coordinators would take those.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, now I request everyone in the meeting, if anyone has a question or a comment to share, please unmute themselves and ask to Vipul sir. And meanwhile, we can take up the questions in the chat box and comments. Sir, there's a question by Niyati Gangawar. Should I read it for you?
Yeah, please.
Requesting the organizers to please raise this question, okay? How should one navigate the multiple interpretations that poetry and other literary genres are prone to while consulting such sources to write environmental history?
All right. Yeah, Niyati. So this is Niyati, isn't it? Good question. Actually, as I mentioned that my attempt here has been to present an eco-critical study of 15th, 16th century texts. And obviously there is not much difference between eco-criticism and environmental history, because in both, the emphasis is on human nature relationship. But obviously the way we use the sources in in writing environmental histories and doing an eco-critical study is slightly different. Now, obviously, both deal with human ecology, both deal with our relationship with the landscapes, both deal with our relationship with the rivers, or for that matter, the forests or the animals. So, in fact, there are views which see the eco-criticism as more. They see that in more of a skeptical way, because there is obviously a factor of ahistoricity involved in the vernacular text. Now, that has been a challenge for the historians. As I mentioned, that we cannot use the vernacular text by picking up informations the way we do for the archival sources. So, but I think eco-criticism basically expands our understanding of human nature relationship, and it lets us understand that the moment we read the text, or any text, and not exactly any text, but the text which talk about the nature aspects. So all these texts are of a particular historical time period. So what we are doing is that we are virtually, when we read those texts, we are actually giving it a historical perspective. So there may be, some kind of a critique, or there may be people who would question the value of the literary text because of for its historical interpretations. But over the last 1 or 2 decades, there has been a growing synergy between the historians and the literary critics, and the way we can use these texts for writing environmental history. Now, obviously, when we do this kind of an eco-critical study, for example, like I have done here in the case of river. Now, we normally avoid distinguishing traditional and state-centric ideologies of conservation. So in conventional sources, or for that matter in many of these sources that we find from the colonial period, this kind of very abstract informations are there. But even there, we try to draw the cultural threads. So here in the text also we look for the cultural threads. So when you talk about the genres, obviously, there is not any specific genre in which these texts were written over a period of time. There were different genres in which the texts were being written. But obviously, we can use these, different texts in a different variety of ways to write the environmental histories.
Right. Thank you, sir.
So, Vipul, if I can add to your response, the text that you are using certainly have, those are historical texts in the sense that they're, the time when they were written, the people who wrote, they are historical figures. And there are, what we can call facticities involved in many of the narratives inside those, texts that you are referring to here with Vidyapati and that Ganga Stuti and other texts. So it is possible, as in the textures of time by Velchuru Narayan Rao, Shulman and others, that there are information in these texts which can be verified on the basis of other texts of the kind that you are using with reference to, let's say, the Mughal texts or the 13th, 14th century, Persian chronicles of Minhaj or Burni. So vernacular texts may have its own sweep and legends and myths, etc. And yet much of the information that they provide can actually be considered historical in the sense of its verifiability with reference to other documents, more hard documents of the kind that the historians look for conventionally, as in the political texts. So this is very interesting work that you are doing, and there are some observations also on Facebook with regard to certain narratives which are relevant to what you have spoken. Now, the two, three things that I would quickly mention, that you're pointing out about the consolidation of those parts which form districts or sarkars of the of Sher Shah and subsequently under Akbar, together form the province of Bihar, which is different from the larger province of Bengal, which is also different from the Jharkhand region in down south. So certainly in the 16th century, a consolidation of Bihari region, and in relation to the Ganges and its tributaries that you are showing is very, very interesting. Now, the thing is that, which I was thinking is this imagination of the river and the ecology creating culture and identity and politics, and say the Bihari identity in this case, is also at the same time traditional and rural and agricultural, and also perhaps urban and cosmopolitan, in the sense that the imagination of the kind that we can see in Bhojpuri and Maithili and Maghi, for the river, is not to be found, say, in Persian in the medieval period, or in English in modern times, or for, say, people in Delhi. Jamna does not, evoke that kind of response as Ganga would be in the rural sector, perhaps, or for, in the sense that rivers can play an important role in Bengal, but it is certainly somewhat meaningless in terms of its presence in Calcutta. In the literary imagination, the river, in cities do not evoke that kind of response of the kind that, say, 15th century authors have done. And therefore, I'll say, why don't you say something in, Maghi or Bhojpuri or Maithili, or what are they saying in the 15th century about these rivers? That expression, a river flowing in my heart, what exactly is the original vernacular expression for the river?
Certainly, thank you, Razi, for such an interesting observation. Obviously, I'm looking for similar texts of the 15th, 16th century in other dialects. But you made a very interesting point, which I, in fact, wanted to tell you, that the boundaries of the sarkar that I just mentioned, they also coincide with the dialectical boundaries. So if you look at the map very carefully, you will find that the sarkars of Bihar, you have different, districts having different dialects. Like in Patna and Gaya, you have Maghi speaking, you have Champaran, Saran, Rohtas as Bhojpuri speaking, you have Hajipur and Tirhut, they are Maithili speaking, and Munger is it's a mixture. It's a mixture of Maithili and Maghi, so it's Angika. So I mean, what I'm suggesting is that this kind of it is really very interesting area to study, that how is it that the rivers actually create these boundaries, not only in administrative terms, but they also create boundaries in terms of dialects. So I'm still, as I mentioned, that this is still work in progress, but I'm looking for such documents for the further documents. I'm studying few of them to come up with a certain conclusion on the dialect itself. So, your intervention about the different, the languages, the Bhojpuri and the Maghi, it certainly is going to be very useful study for me. Thank you, Razi, for the fine intervention.
Thank you, sir.
Very useful.
So if we have 5-7 minutes, yes, we have. Can we just please take 2-3 questions here in the chat box? Shakir Hassan has this question. Sir, could you please again clarify more about Lieberman's exposed zones and how do you conceptualize this vast complex region differently?
Yeah, Shakir, in fact, Lieberman has uh, uh, written a very interesting, I mean, it's a 2-volume book. It's called Strange Parallels. So that book actually talks about different, it's a global history, kind of a global history. But then it also gives reference, he talks about, I mean, he has given 2 broader concepts called the protected zones and the exposed zones. Now, in the case of the entire Indo-Gangetic area, all the areas along the Ganges, he says that these are all exposed area, and that's why the Central Asian invaders came and controlled and took control of the entire area. Now, when he talks about the protected zones, he talks about the protected territories of the Europeans. So the Central Asian did not reach there. And he talks about the protection, the geographical barriers that acted as protection for those protected zones. Now here, in the case of, I mean, the kind of generalization that Victor Lieberman has done is not right. Because I mentioned that this, you can talk about the upper part of the Ganga Basin, where the river flows through deep gorges. So there, I mean, it was easy for the Central Asian invaders to move on the horses and take control of the territories. But when they come to territories like the mid-Ganga Basin, where you have many rivers crisscrossing, then it was not easy for these, horse, for all these contingents who are moving on the horses and to take control of the area. So we have instances, various instances of such kind. In fact, there is another very interesting episode of Jahangir's period that he mentions that in his Jahangir Nama about the kind of rebellion that he faced and what he had to do to take control of the rebellion. I mean, all this is mentioned in the account. In fact, he mentions about one of the Mansabdar who was who was named later as the governor of this province, Bihar province, during the reign of Jahangir. And in fact, he had gone to collect revenue from his Jagir, which was in Kharagpur. Right. So what happened that few of the local zamindars, they took control of Patna fort. Now, there was a confidant who had of this Mansabdar, his name was Afzal Khan. So he informed what he did, that he escaped through a boat, crossed the Ganga, went to Kharagpur, informed that Mansabdar that your fort has been captured. Now, just imagine this guy, Afzal Khan, does not dare to take a river route. He might have taken a river route to reach Patna faster and in a much shorter time, but he reaches near Patna in 5 days because he comes on a horse. And then he fights a battle on the bank of Punpun River, which is located on the east side of the city. And by that time, much of the treasury was already looted. Now, these are the kind of challenges that this territory had. So despite declaring these areas as part of the Mughal Empire, this was not an easy area to take control. So I think the kind of the argument that we hear from mainstream historians about the firm control of the entire Mughal Empire, I think that's questionable also, especially when we talk about this region.
Shakir, you're on mute. Okay. Okay, sir, we have two hand raised, Nagwand and Mutums as well. And we have two questions in the chat box. Can we please take up the questions by Mutum?
One, please.
Yeah.
One.
Am I audible?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, sir. This is Kennedy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for showing that early modern kind of a history of such river ecologies can be written, because like my own familiarity with the Northeast and how recently an environmental history of Brahmaputra and how works by historian like David Zhu has also kind of adopted this practice, where Assam was also kind of imagined through the river, through Brahmaputra. So how the administrative and the spatial organization of a particular region can be impacted by the river ecology. So thank you for bringing that in focus, because even in Assam, the way why we refer to Assam as Upper Assam or Lower Assam, that has a lot to do with how the region was initially imagined by the surveyors in when they initially came to Assam after the first Anglo-Burmese War. So thank you for bringing this in focus and how showing how such a history could be also written for early modern period and the Mughal world order. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Cornelia.
Nagwand?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you,
Nagman.
thank you, Soumya. Thank you for allowing me. Thank you, people, sir, for this enlightening lecture. I am really fascinated by your arguments. So my question is very much confined towards the way you have articulated the vernacular literature in your analysis. So I am wondering about the aspects of methodological inputs that you have analyzed in your paper, that the term close reading. So I am wondering about how, if we really interested to know about the ecological settings that has been portrayed in the vernacular literature. So I personally encounter so much difficulties while dealing with these things, that that the aspects of recurring that continuously happening in the vernacular literature, the particular genre per se I am talking about. So how do you differentiate particular kind of depiction about ecological setting, that it is a temporal depiction of that period, or it is just a recurring that genre exercise in its while it's engaging with the genre. So how we can differentiate the historicity in it? So I am just wondering, because I am also challenging these kind of challenges. I am also encountering. So I am just wondered how to know how to differentiate these depictions. So if you could clarify.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think, as I mentioned while answering for one of the questions that came earlier on, you have different genres for different territories. I mean, there is no specific genre of writing, vernacular texts for different period of time. Obviously, the mid-Ganga region that I mentioned, like many other modern regions of India, it had no single genre which was followed in history writing. It was certainly different from the genre of history writing that we actually know and which we see in the Persian texts. So history in that sense, in the vernacular texts, was obviously written in a variety of genres. In fact, in this region, the texts were being written taking into consideration, the choices of the subjects, the kind of audience, and the kind of geography that the author faces, or the kind of culture that the author sees. So when we read these texts, we need to see their location, the choice of the medium by the author, and similarly, the given moment is also very important. that at what particular period this has been written. So when we read them, we need to figure out the intended meaning and the unsaid message that the writer has sent us. No, not exactly in those terms, because like if I say that few of the texts that I picked up, they talk about the human nature relationship, that I don't know what the poet was thinking about. But when the poet mentions about that specifically in those particular texts, because in many of his, Vidyapati's many other texts, you don't find mention of such geographies. He doesn't talk about those socio-ecologies that I just mentioned. So why in a particular specific text he talks about those, and then he blends them with Puranic stories? So that's something. So this Puranic story is not exactly something which is very important for me. This Puranic story is important for me as a historian only when I read it in the context of the kind of geography that he talks about, the kind of cultural connects that he wants to give through those stories. Now, there is, in fact, I forgot to mention during the course of my discussion about Padavali's, this combination of and the kind of nature of element that we find in Padavali. You will find that in Padavali, you have a combination of both what I say, the mixture of the profane element and the kind of, what should I say, the divinity aspect, the relationship that Radha and Krishna is having. Obviously, Padavali was influenced by Geet Govinda. So if we read the poetry carefully, we'll find that the Vidyapati has merged both the sacred aspects and the profane aspect that I just mentioned, and he mixes them to show the passionate relationship between Radha and Krishna. But when he shows this, if you read that text in isolation, you will find that it will appear to be very erotic, but it is actually deliberate. It is deliberate because when he's trying to show them the relationship of Radha and Krishna in erotic form, he uses nature as, kind of in a symbolic way. Because when he uses nature, it does not remain erotic in the same sense. This kind of a calibration, in fact, of the nature thing with human relationship was never resisted by the society. That's why, because it is because of this that you find that this kind of a Radha Krishna poetry of Vidyapati remained in existence for so many centuries, and it is so popular even today. So when we have to understand that why exactly the poet is talking about certain mythologies, why he's talking about a mythology in the context of the particular time period he's mentioning, particular geographies that he's mentioning. So for different reason or for different text, you will find different elements. So I picked up few of the texts which were talking about nature things along with the Puranic stories and along with the various fictional stories. So I think that's how we can use these different literatures for writing histories.
Pushparanjan has made a good observation. If Shaumya can read out for Vipul, and with which maybe Vipul can have the last, comment, and we'll stop on Vidyapati's death.
Yes, sir. Vidyapati's death was also shrouded in folklore. It was said that when he realized that his time was coming to a close, he set about to end his days on the Ganga. And he has also written about the creation of Chumar Fort was an important river strategy during Sher Shah Suri's time. This indeed worth he loved listening to you, and Seven Sarkar is an interesting part of the discussion, he said.
Thank you, Pushparanjan ji.
So if you,
I think, I think, I mean, these are, there is no, I mean, there is still debate going on whether Vidyapati, there are historians who believe that died in the Ganga. Now, as I mentioned that although Vidyapati belonged to a region which was quite far away from the Ganga, but Ganga was so well ingrained in the minds of the people living in that area because he was living close to Bagmati. But the Ganga has been very important river. It's most revered river. It has been mentioned time and again than any other river in his stories. So obviously, I mean, when I read Vidyapati, I read him as somebody who is a poet and who is living at a time when Ganga is actually so much associated with the people living in that area. I mean, it is still associated. In fact, as we are aware that in 2014, political leaders have often used these imageries of the rivers, the Ganga. They have used this to, send a message that to the people living along the Ganges, living not only along the Ganges, but far away from the Ganges, who associate themselves with the Ganges, to get some kind of influence, maybe in the election. But then, I mean, it is still continuing. People are still associating themselves with the river Ganga, and the Ganga is so very important in this part of India.
thank you so much, sir. So if you please allow some more minutes to us, we have questions.
I think
only if you say.
Because Razi knows this.
Okay.
I hope
I
you
think
will.
we can stop now, and I can see Mona Lisa Banderecha has been raising her hand for asking questions. So maybe she can write to Professor Vipul Singh directly. Mona Lisa is a student in the department. And thank you very much. It was such a fine lecture, and there is so much to think about: how to use the vernacular material, how to check its facticity, and the making of a region in relation to the ecology, river in this case. Very, very interesting. And maybe you will come back again with an article or book that you will ask us to read and learn further on this. Soumya was conducting this. So you're confusing Soumya with Arushi. Arushi is also here.
But, sorry, Soumya. I was.
It's okay, sir. I didn't want to interrupt you. Totally.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Soumya. Thank you, Vipul.
Sir, I just want to announce the next talk. We have on 16th a talk by Professor Suchandra Ghosh on ancient India. I would request everyone to please join us on 16th February as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Vipul, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.